Story 4, Part 1 of Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. Sea Stories, edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 4, Part 1. The Pilot. The hero of Cooper's stirring sea tale is a mysterious pilot known as Mr. Gray, who during the American Revolution came aboard the Yankee frigate Alliance one stormy night to guide her in a privateering expedition along the east coast of England. Captain Munson had been entrusted by Congress with the dangerous errand of venturing into the enemy's own waters in order to capture prize ships and prisoners of war, who were to be held for exchange. Inspired by the pilot's presence, the daring Yankee bluejackets captured the British cutter Alacrity in a sharp contest near the shore. Following this victory, the frigate's officers in council determined upon an invasion of the enemy's country. Accordingly, one night a party of officers and marines from the Alliance, headed by the pilot himself, landed near the Abbey of St. Ruth, and after many exciting adventures and narrow escapes, secured as prisoners Captain Borrowcliff of the King's service. Colonel Howard, a wealthy Tory, recently returned from America, and the latter's nieces, Cecilia Howard and Catherine Plowden. Before leaving America, the girls had become engaged to Griffith and Barnstable, young lieutenants on this very frigate, and it was to separate them from their Yankee lovers that Colonel Howard had brought his wards to England, guarding them like prisoners at St. Ruth's. Moreover, Mary, the midshipman on board the Alliance, was the girls' favorite cousin. They therefore willingly accepted the situation, and were not sorry to be transported to the frigate, preparing to enjoy a sea voyage in pleasant company. But the officers knew that reports of the Yankee cruiser must have spread abroad and that pursuit was to be expected. The following pages describes the narrow escape of the Alliance from a British man-of-war. The escape of the American frigate Alliance. From the pilot, by J.F. Cooper. Furious press the hostile squadron. Furious he repels their rage. Loss of blood at length enfeebles. Who can war with thousands wage? Spanish war song. We cannot detain the narrative to detail the scenes which busy wonder, aided by the relation of many marvelous feats, produced among the curious seamen who remained in the ship, and their more fortunate fellows who had returned glory from an expedition to the land. For nearly an hour the turbulence of a general movement was heard, issuing from the deep recesses of the frigate, and the boisterous sound of hoarse merriment were listened to by the officers in indulgent silence. But all those symptoms of unbridled humour ceased by the time the morning repast was ended, when the regular sea watch was set, and the greater portion of those whose duty did not require their presence on the vessel's deck availed themselves of the opportunity to repair the loss of sleep sustained in the preceding night. Still no preparations were made to put the ship in motion, though long and earnest consultations, which were supposed to relate to their future destiny, were observed by the younger officers to be held between their captain, the first lieutenant, and the mysterious pilot. The latter threw many an anxious glance along the eastern horizon, searching it minutely with his glass, and then would turn his impatient look at the low, dense bank of fog which, stretching across the ocean like a barrier of cloud, entirely intercepted the view towards the south. To the north and along the land the air was clear, and the sea without spot of any kind, but in the east a small white sail had been discovered since the opening of day, which was gradually rising above the water, and assuming the appearance of a vessel of some size. Every officer on the quarterdeck in his turn had examined this distant sail, and had ventured an opinion on its destination and character; and even Catherine, who with her cousin was enjoying in the open air the novel beauties of the ocean, had been tempted to place her sparkling eye to a glass, to gaze at the stranger. "It is a collier," Griffith said, "who has hauled from the land in the late gale, and who is luffing up to his course again. If the wind holds here in the south, and he does not get into that fog bank, we can stand off for him and get a supply of fuel before 8 bells are struck. I think his head is to the northward, and that he is steering off the wind," returned the pilot, in a musing manner. "If that Dillon succeeded in getting his express far enough along the coast, the alarm has been spread, and we must be wary. The convoy of the Baltic trade is in the North Sea. The news of our presence could easily have been taken off to it by some of the cutters that line the coast. I could wish to get the ships as far south as the Helder." "Then we lose this weather tide," exclaimed the impatient Griffith. "Surely we have the cutter as a lookout. Besides, by beating into the fog, we shall lose the enemy, if enemy it be. And is it thought right for an American frigate to skulk from her foes?" The scornful expression that kindled the eye of the pilot, like a gleam of sunshine lighting for an instant some dark dell and laying bare its secrets, was soon lost in the usually quiet look of his glance, though he hesitated, like one who was struggling with his passions, before he answered: "If prudence and the service of the States require it, even this proud frigate must retreat and hide from the meanest of her enemies. My advice, Captain Munson, is that you make sail and beat the ship to the windward, as Mr. Griffith has suggested, and that you order the cutter to precede us, keeping more in with the land." The aged seaman, who evidently suspended his orders, only to receive an intimation of the other's pleasure, immediately commanded his youthful assistant to issue the necessary mandates to put these measures in force. Accordingly, the Alacrity, which vessel had been left under the command of the junior lieutenant of the frigate, was quickly under way, and making short stretches to the windward, she soon entered the bank of fog and was lost to the eye. In the meantime the canvas of the ship was loosened and spread leisurely, in order not to disturb the portion of the crew who were sleeping, and, following her little consort, she moved heavily through the water, bearing up against the dull breeze. The quiet of regular duty had succeeded to the bustle of making sail, and, as the ray of the sun fell less obliquely on the distant land, Catherine and Cecilia were amusing Griffith by vain attempts to point out the rounded eminences which they fancied lay in the vicinity of the deserted mansion of St. Ruth. Barnstable, who had resumed his former station in the frigate, as her second lieutenant, was pacing the opposite side of the quarterdeck, holding under his arm the speaking trumpet, which denoted that he held the temporary control of the motions of the ship, and inwardly cursing the restraint that kept him from the side of his mistress. At this moment of universal quiet, when nothing above low dialogues interrupted the dashing of the waves as they were thrown lazily aside by the bows of the vessel, the report of a light cannon burst out of the barrier of fog, and then rolled by them on the breeze, apparently vibrating with the rising and sinking of the waters. "There goes the cutter!" exclaimed Griffith, the instant the sound was heard. "Surely," said the captain, "Somers is not so indiscreet as to scale his guns, after the caution he has received." "No idle scaling of guns is intended there," said the pilot, straining his eyes to pierce the fog, but soon turning away in disappointment at his inability to succeed. "That gun is shotted, and has been fired in the hurry of a sudden signal. Can your lookout see nothing, Mr. Barnstable?" The lieutenant of the watch hailed a man aloft, and demanded if anything were visible in the direction of the wind, and received for answer that the fog intercepted the view in that quarter of the heavens, but that the sail in the east was a ship running large or before the wind. The pilot shook his head doubtingly at this information, but still he manifested a strong reluctance to relinquish the attempt of getting more to the southward. Again he communed with the commander of the frigate, apart from all other ears, and while they yet deliberated, a second report was heard, leaving no doubt that the Alacrity was firing signal guns for their particular attention. "Perhaps," said Griffith, "he wishes to point out his position, or to ascertain ours, believing that we are lost like himself in the mist." "We have our compasses," returned the doubting captain. "Somers has a meaning in what he says." "See," cried Catherine with girlish delight. "See, my cousin, see, Barnstable, how beautifully that vapor is wreathing itself in clouds above the smoky line of fog. It stretches already into the very heavens like a lofty pyramid." Barnstable sprang lightly on a gun as he repeated her words. "Pyramids of fog and wreathing clouds! By heavens," he shouted, "'tis a tall ship! Royals, sky sails, and studding sails all abroad! She is within a mile of us, and comes down like a racehorse with a spanking breeze, dead before it. Now we know why Somers is speaking in the mist." "Aye," cried Griffith, "and there goes the Alacrity, just breaking out of the fog, hovering in for the land. There is a mighty hull under all that cloud of canvas, Captain Munson," said the observant but calm pilot. "It is time, gentlemen, to edge away to leeward." "What, before we know from whom we run?" cried Griffith. "My life on it, there is no single ship King George owns but would tire of the sport before she had played a full game of bowls with." The haughty air of the young man was daunted by the severe look he encountered in the eye of the pilot, and he suddenly ceased, though inwardly chafing with impatient pride. The same eye that detected the canvas above the fog might have seen the flag of a vice admiral fluttering still nearer the heavens, returned the collected stranger, and England, faulty as she may be, is yet too generous to place a flag officer in time of war in command of a frigate, or a captain in command of a fleet. She knows the value of those who shed their blood in her behalf, and it is thus that she is so well served. Believe me, Captain Munson, there is nothing short of a ship of the line under the symbol of rank, and that broad show of canvas." "We shall see, sir, we shall see," returned the old officer, whose manner grew decided, as the danger appeared to thicken. "Beat to quarters, Mr. Griffith, for we have none but enemies to expect on this coast." The order was instantly issued, when Griffith remarked with a more temperate zeal, "If Mr. Gray be right, we shall have reason to thank God that we are so light of heel." The cry of the strange vessel close aboard the frigate having already flown down the hatches, the ship was in an uproar at the first tap of the drum. The seamen threw themselves from their hammocks, and lashing them rapidly into long, hard bundles, they rushed to the decks, where they were dexterously stowed in the netting, to aid the defenses of the upper part of the vessel. While this tumultuous scene was exhibiting, Griffith gave a secret order to Mary, who disappeared, leading his trembling cousins to a place of safety in the inmost depths of the ship. The guns were cleared of their lumber and loosened. The bulkheads were knocked down, and the cabin relieved of its furniture, and the gun deck exhibited one unbroken line of formidable cannon, arranged in all the order of a naval battery, ready to engage. Arm chests were thrown open, and the deck strewed with pikes, cutlasses, pistols, and all the various weapons for boarding. In short, the yards were slung, and every other arrangement was made with readiness and dexterity that were actually wonderful. Though all was performed amid an appearance of disorder and confusion that rendered the ship another Babel during the continuance of the preparations, in a very few minutes everything was completed, and even the voices of the men ceased to be heard answering to their names, as they were mustered at their stations by their respective officers. Gradually the ship became as quiet as the grave, and when even Griffith or his commander found it necessary to speak, their voices were calmer and their tones more mild than usual. The course of the vessel was changed to an oblique line from that in which their enemy was approaching, though the appearance of flight was to be studiously avoided to the last moment. When nothing further remained to be done, every eye became fixed on the enormous pile of swelling canvas that was rising, in cloud over cloud, far above the fog, and which was manifestly moving, like driving vapor, swiftly to the north. Presently the dull smoky boundary of the mist which rested on the water was pushed aside in vast volumes, and the long tapered spars that projected from the bowsprit of the strange ship issued from the obscurity, and were quickly followed by the whole of the enormous fabric to which they were merely light appendages. For a moment streaks of reluctant vapor clung to the huge floating pile, but they were soon shaken off by the rapid vessel, and the whole of her black hull became distinct to the eye. 1, 2, 3 rows of teeth, said Boltroff, deliberately counting the tiers of guns that bristled along the sides of the enemy. A three-decker. John Manley would show his stern to such a fellow, and even the Scotsman would run. "Hard up with your helm, quartermaster," cried Captain Munson. "There is indeed no time to hesitate, with such an enemy within a quarter of a mile. Turn the hands up, Mr. Griffith, and pack on the ships from her trucks to her lower studding sail booms. Be stirring, sir, be stirring. Hard up with your helm. Hard up, sir." The unusual earnestness of their aged commander acted on the startled crew like a voice from the deep, and they waited not for the usual signals of the boatswain and the drummer to be given, before they broke away from their guns, and rushed tumultuously to aid in spreading the desired canvas. There was 1 minute of ominous confusion, that to an inexperienced eye would have foreboded the destruction of all order in the vessel, during which every hand and each tongue seemed in motion, but it ended in opening the immense folds of light duct which were displayed along the whole line of the masts, far beyond the ordinary sails, overshadowing the waters for a great distance on either side of the vessel. During the moment of inaction that succeeded this sudden exertion, the breeze, which had brought up the three-decker, fell fresher on the sails of the frigate, and she started away from her dangerous enemy with a perceptible advantage in point of sailing. "The fog rises," cried Griffith. "Give us but the wind for an hour, and we shall run her out of gunshot." "These 90s are very fast off the wind," returned the captain, in a low tone that was intended only for the ears of his first lieutenant and the pilot, "and we shall have a struggle for it." The quick eye of the stranger was glancing over the movements of his enemy while he answered, "He finds we have the heels of him already. He is making ready, and we shall be fortunate to escape a broadside. Let her yaw a little, Mr. Griffith. Touch her lightly with the helm. If we are raked, sir, we are lost." The captain sprang on the taffrail of his ship with the activity of a younger man, and in an instant he perceived the truth of the other's conjecture. Both vessels now ran for a few minutes, keenly watching each other's motions like two skilful combatants, the English ship making a slight deviation from the line of her course, and then, as her movements were anticipated by the other, turning as cautiously in the opposite direction, until a sudden and wide sweep of her huge bows told the Americans plainly on which tack to expect her. Captain Munson made a silent but impressive gesture with his arm, as if the crisis were too important for speech, which indicated to the watchful Griffith the way he wished the frigate sheered, to avoid the weight of the impending danger. Both vessels whirled swiftly up to the wind with their heads towards the land, and as the huge black side of the three-decker, checkered with its triple batteries, frowned full upon her foe, it belched forth a flood of fire and smoke, accompanied by a bellowing roar that mocked the surly moanings of the sleeping ocean. The nerves of the bravest man in the frigate contracted their fibers, as the hurricane of iron hurtled by them, and each eye appeared to gaze in stupid wonder, as if tracing the flight of the swift engines of destruction. But the voice of Captain Munson was heard in the din, shouting while he waved his hat earnestly in the required direction. "Meet her! Meet her with the helm, boy! Meet her, Mr. Griffith! Meet her!" Griffith had so far anticipated this movement as to have already ordered the head of the frigate to be turned in its former course, when struck by the unearthly cry of the last tones uttered by his commander. He bent his head, and beheld the venerable seaman driven through the air, his hat still waving, his grey hair floating in the wind, and his eye set in the wild look of death. "Great God!" exclaimed the young man, rushing to the side of the ship, where he was just in time to see the lifeless body disappear in the waters that were dyed in its blood. "He has been struck by a shot. Lower away the boats! Lower away the jolly boat, the barge, the Tiger, the—" "'Tis useless," interrupted the calm, deep voice of the pilot. "He has met a warrior's end, and sleeps in a sailor's grave. The ship is getting before the wind again, and the enemy is keeping his vessel away." The youthful lieutenant was recalled by these words to his duty, and reluctantly turned his eyes away from the bloody spot on the waters, which the busy frigate had already passed, to resume the command of the vessel with a forced composure. "He has cut some of our running gear," said the master, whose eye had never ceased to dwell on the spars and rigging of the ship, "and there's a splinter out of the main topmast that is big enough for a fid. He has let daylight through some of our canvas too, but taking it by and large, the squall has gone over and little harm done. Didn't I hear something said of Captain Munson getting jammed by a shot?" "He is killed," said Griffith, speaking in a voice that was yet husky with horror. "He is dead, sir, and carried overboard. There is more need than we forget not ourselves in this crisis." "Dead?" said Boltrope, suspending the operation of his active jaws for a moment, in surprise. "And buried in a wet jacket? Well, it is lucky 'tis no worse, for damned if I did not think every stick in the ship would have been cut out of her." With this consolatory remark on his lips, the master walked slowly forward, continuing his orders to repair the damages with a singleness of purpose that rendered him, however uncouth as a friend, an invaluable man in his station. Griffith had not yet brought his mind to the calmness that was so essential to discharge duties which had thus suddenly and awfully devolved on him, when his elbow was lightly touched by the pilot, who had drawn closer to his side. "The enemy appeared satisfied with the experiment," said the stranger, "and as we work the quicker of the two, he loses too much ground to repeat it, if he be a true seaman." "And yet he finds we leave him so fast," returned Griffith. "He must see that all his hopes rest in cutting us up aloft. I dread that he will come by the wind again, and lay us under his broadside. We should need a quarter of an hour to run without his range, if he were anchored. He plays a sure game. See you not that the vessel we made in the eastern board shows the hull of the frigate? 'Tis past a doubt that they are of one squadron, and that the expresses have sent them in our wake. The English admiral has spread a broad clue, Mr. Griffith, and as he gathers in his ships, he sees that his game has been successful." The faculties of Griffith had been too much occupied with the hurry of the chase to look at the ocean, but, startled at the information of the pilot, who spoke coolly, though like a man sensible of the existence of approaching danger, he took the glass from the other, and with his own eye examined the different vessels in sight. It is certain that the experienced officer, whose flag was flying above the light sails of the three-decker, saw the critical situation of his chase, and reasoned much in the same manner as the pilot, or the fearful expedient apprehended by Griffith would have been adopted. Prudence, however, dictated that he should prevent his enemy from escaping by pressing so closely on his rear, as to render it impossible for the American to haul across his bows and run into the open sea between his own vessel and the nearest frigate of his squadron. The unpractised reader will be able to comprehend the case better by accompanying the understanding eye of Griffith, as it glanced from point to point, following the whole horizon. To the west lay the land along which the Alacrity was urging her way industriously, with the double purpose of keeping her consort abeam, and of avoiding a dangerous proximity to their powerful enemy. To the east, bearing off the starboard bow of the American frigate, was the vessel first seen, and which now began to exhibit the hostile appearance of a ship of war, steering in a line converging towards themselves, and rapidly drawing nigher, while far in the northeast was a vessel as yet faintly discerned, whose evolutions could not be mistaken by one who understood the movements of nautical warfare. "We are hemmed in effectually," said Griffith, dropping the glass from his eye, "and I know not but our wisest course would be to haul in to land, and, cutting everything light adrift, endeavor to pass the broadside of the flagship." "Provided she left a rag of canvas to do it with," returned the pilot. "Sir, 'tis an idle hope. She would strip your ship in 10 minutes, to her plank shears, had it not been for a lucky wave on which so many of her shot struck and glanced upward. We should have nothing to boast of left from the fire she has already given. We must stand on and drop the three-decker as far as possible." "But the frigates," said Griffith. "What are we to do with the frigates?" "Fight them," returned the pilot, in a low, determined voice. "Fight them, young man. I have borne the stars and stripes aloft in greater straits than this, and even with honor. Think not that my fortune will desert me now. We shall have an hour of desperate battle. On that we may calculate. But I have lived through whole days of bloodshed. You seem not one to quail at the sight of an enemy." "Let me proclaim your name to the men," said Griffith. "'Twill quicken their blood, and at such a moment be a host in itself." "They want it not," returned the pilot, checking the hasty zeal of the other with his hand. "I would be unnoticed. unless I am known as becomes me. I will share your danger, but would not rob you of a title of your glory. Should we come to grapple," he continued, while a smile of conspicuous pride gleamed across his face, "I will give forth the word as a war cry, and, believe me, these English will quail before it." Griffith submitted to the stranger's will, and, after they had deliberated further on the nature of their evolutions, he gave his attention again to the management of the vessel. The first object which met his eye on turning from the pilot was Colonel Howard, pacing the quarter-deck with a determined brow and a haughty mien, as if already in the enjoyment of that triumph which now seemed certain. "I fear, sir," said the young man, approaching him with respect, "that you will soon find the deck unpleasant and dangerous. Your words are—" "Mention not the unworthy term," interrupted the colonel. "What greater pleasure can there be than to inhale the odor of loyalty that is wafted from yonder floating tower of the king? And danger? You know but little of old George Howard, young man, if you think he would for thousands miss seeing that symbol of rebellion levelled before the flag of his majesty." "If that be your wish, Colonel Howard," returned Griffith, biting his lip, as he looked around at the wondering seamen who were listeners, "you will wait in vain, but I pledge you my word that when that time arrives you shall be advised, and that your own hand shall do the ignoble deed. Edward Griffith, why not this moment? This is your moment of probation. Submit to the clemency of the crown, and yield your crew to the royal mercy. In such a case I would remember the child of my brother Harry's friend, and believe me, my name is known to the ministry. And you, misguided and ignorant abettors of rebellion, cast aside your useless weapons, or prepare to meet the vengeance of yonder powerful and victorious servant of your prince." "Fall back! Back with ye, fellows!" cried Griffith fiercely to the men who were gathering around the colonel, with looks of sullen vengeance. "If a man of you dare approach him, he shall be cast into the sea." The sailors retreated at the order of their commander, but the elated veteran had continued to pace the deck for many minutes before stronger interests diverted the angry glances of the seamen to other objects. End of Story 4, Part 1. Story 4, Part 2 of the Sea Stories. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading done by Jules Harlock. Sea Stories edited by Cyrus Townsend Brady. Story 4, Part 2. The Escape of the American Frigate Alliance. From the Pilot, by J. F. Cooper. Notwithstanding, the ship of the line was slowly sinking beneath the distant waves, and in less than an hour from the time she had fired the broadside, no more than one of her 3 tiers of guns was visible from the deck of the frigate. She yet presented an irresistible obstacle against retreat to the south. On the other hand, the ship first seen drew so nigh as to render the glass no longer necessary in watching her movements. She proved to be a frigate, though one so materially lighter than the American as to have rendered her conquest easy, had not her 2 consorts continued to press on for the scene of battle with such rapidity. During the chase, the scene had shifted from the point opposite to St. Ruth, to the verge of those shoals where our tale commenced. As they approached the latter, the smallest of the English ships drew so nigh as to render the combat unavoidable. Griffith and his crew had not been idle in the intermediate time, but all the usual preparations against the casualties of a sea fight had been duly made. When the drum once more called the men to their quarters, and the ship was deliberately stripped of her unnecessary sails, like a prize fighter about to enter the arena, casting aside the encumbrances of dress. At the instant she gave this intimation of her intention to abandon flight and trust the issue to the combat, the nearest English frigate also took in her light canvas in token of her acceptance of the challenge. "He is but a little fellow," said Griffith to the pilot, who hovered at his elbow with a sort of fatherly interest in the other's conduct of the battle, "though he carries a stout heart." "We must crush him at a blow," returned the stranger. "Not a shot must be delivered until our yards are locking. I see him training his 12s upon us already. We may soon expect his fire." "After standing the brunt of a 90-gun ship," observed the collected pilot, "we shall not shrink from a broadside of a 32. "Stand to your guns, men!" cried Griffith through his trumpet. "Not a shot to be fired without the order." This caution, so necessary to check the ardor of the seamen, was hardly uttered, before the enemy became wrapped in sheets of fire and volumes of smoke, as gun after gun hurled its iron missiles at their vessel in quick succession. 10 minutes might have passed, the two vessels sheering close to each other every foot they advanced, during which time the crew of the American were compelled, by their commander, to suffer the fire of their adversary without returning a shot. This short period, which seemed an age to the seamen, was distinguished in their vessel by deep silence. Even the wounded and dying, who fell in every part of the ship, stifled their groans under the influence of the severe discipline, which gave a character to every man and each movement of the vessel, and those officers who were required to speak were heard only in the lowest tones of resolute preparation. At length the ship slowly entered the skirts of the smoke that enveloped the enemy, and Griffith heard the man who stood at the side whisper the word "Now!" "Let them have it!" cried Griffith, in a voice that was heard in the remotest parts of the ship. The shout that burst from the seamen appeared to lift the decks of the vessel, and the affrighted frigate trembled like an aspen with the recoil of her own massive artillery. That shot forth a single sheet of flame, the sailors having disregarded, in their impatience, the usual order of firing. The effect of the broadside on the enemy was still more dreadful, for a death-like silence succeeded to the roar of guns, which were only broken by the shrieks and execrations that burst from her, like the moanings of the damned. During the few moments in which the Americans were again loading their cannon, and the English were recovering from their confusion, the vessel of the former moved slowly past her antagonist, and was already doubling across her bows, when the latter was suddenly, and, considering the inequality of their forces, it may be added desperately, headed into her enemy. The two frigates grappled. The sudden and furious charge made by the Englishman, as he threw his masses of daring seamen along his bowsprit and out of his channels, had nearly taken Griffith by surprise, but Manuel, who had delivered his first fire with the broadside, now did good service, by ordering his men to beat back the intruders by a steady and continued discharge. Even the wary pilot lost sight of their other foes, in the high daring of that moment, and smiles of stern pleasure were exchanged between him and Griffith, as both comprehended, at a glance, their advantages. "Lash his bowsprit to our mizzen-mast," shouted the lieutenant, "and we will sweep his deck as he lies." 20 men sprang eagerly forward to execute the order, among the foremost of whom were Boltrope And the stranger. Aye, now he's our own, cried the busy master, and we will take an owner's liberties with him, and break him up, for by the eternal— Peace, rude man, said the pilot, in a voice of solemn remonstrance. At the next instant you may face your God. Mock not his awful name. The master found time, before he threw himself from the spar on the deck of the frigate again, to cast a look of amazement at his companion, who, with a steady mien, but with an eye that lighted with a warrior's ardor, viewed the battle that raged around him like one who marks its progress to control the result. The two frigates grappled. The sight of the Englishmen rushing onward with shouts and bitter menaces warmed the blood of Colonel Howard, who pressed to the side of the frigate, and encouraged his friends by his gestures and voice to come on. "Away with ye, old croaker!" cried the master, seizing him by the collar. "Away with ye to the hold, or I'll order you fired from a gun." "Down with your arms, rebellious dog!" shouted the colonel, carried beyond himself by the ardor of the fray. "Down to the dust, and implore the mercy of your injured prince." Invigorated by a momentary glow, the veteran grappled with his brawny antagonist, but the issue of the short struggle was yet suspended, when the English, driven back by the fire of the marines and the menacing front that Griffith with his boarders presented, retreated to the forecastle of their own ship, and attempted to return the deadly blows they were receiving in their hull from the cannon that Barnstable directed. A solitary gun was all they could bring to bear on the Americans, but this, loaded with canister, was fired so near as to send its glaring flame into the very faces of their enemies. The struggling colonel, who was already sinking beneath the arm of his foe, felt the rough grasp loosen from his throat at the flash, and the two combatants sunk powerless on their knees, facing each other. "How now, brother?" exclaimed Boltrope, with a smile of grim fierceness. "Some of that grist has gone to your mill. Ha!" No answer could, however, be given before the yielding forms of both fell to the deck, where they lay helpless amid the din of the battle and the wild confusion of the eager combatants. Notwithstanding the furious struggle they had witnessed, the elements did not cease their functions, and, urged by the breeze and lifted irresistibly on a wave, the American ship was forced through the water still farther across the bows of her enemy. The idle fastenings of hemp and iron were snapped asunder like strings of tow, and Griffith saw his own ship borne away from the Englishman at the instant that the bowsprit of the latter was torn from its lashings and tumbled into the sea, followed by spar after spar, until nothing of all her proud tackling was remaining but the few parted and useless ropes that were left dangling along the stumps of her lower masts. As his own stately vessel moved from the confusion she had caused, and left the dense cloud of smoke in which her helpless antagonist lay, the eye of the young man glanced anxiously toward the horizon, where he now remembered he had more foes to contend against. "We have shaken off the 32 most happily," he said to the pilot, who followed his motions with singular interest. "But here is another fellow sheering in for us, who shows as many ports as ourselves, and who appears inclined for a closer interview. Besides, the hull of the 90 is rising again, and I fear that she will be down but too soon." "We must keep the use of our braces and sails," returned the pilot, "and on no account close with the other frigate. We must play a double game, sir, and fight this new adversary with our heels as well as with our guns. 'Tis time then that we were busy, for he is shortening sail." and as he nears so fast we must expect to hear from him every minute. What do you propose, sir?" "Let him gather in his canvas," returned the pilot, "and when he thinks himself snug, we can throw out 100 men at once upon our yards, and spread everything alow and aloft. We may then draw ahead of him by surprise, if we can once get him in our wake. I have no fears of dropping them all." "A stern chase is a long chase," cried Griffith, "and the thing may do. Clear up the decks here and carry down the wounded, and, as we have our hands full, the poor fellows who have done with us must go overboard at once." This melancholy duty was instantly attended to, while the young seaman who commanded the frigate returned to his duty, with the absorbed air of one who felt its high responsibility. These occupations, however, did not prevent his hearing the sound of Barnstable's voice calling eagerly to young Mary. Bending his head towards the sound, Griffith beheld his friend, looking anxiously up the main hatch, with a face grimed with smoke, his coat off, and his shirt bespattered with human blood. "Tell me, boy," he said, "is Mr. Griffith untouched?" "They say that a shot came in upon the quarterdeck that tripped up the heels of half a dozen." Before Mary could answer, the eyes of Barnstable, which even while he spoke were scanning the state of the vessel's rigging, encountered the kind looks of Griffith, and from that moment perfect harmony was restored between the friends. "Ah, you are here, Griff, and with a whole skin, I see," cried Barnstable, smiling with pleasure. "They have passed poor Boltrope down into one of his own storerooms. If that fellow's bowsprit had held on 10 minutes longer, what a mark I should have made on his face and eyes." "'Tis perhaps best as it is," returned Griffith. "But what have ye done with those whom we are most bound to protect?" Barnstable made a significant gesture towards the depth of the vessel, as he answered, "On the cables, safe as wood, iron, and water can keep them. Though Catherine has had her head up 3 times too." A summons from the pilot drew Griffith away, and the young officers were compelled to forget their individual feelings in the pressing duties of their stations. The ship which the American frigate had now to oppose was a vessel of near her own size and equipage, and when Griffith looked at her again, he perceived that she had made her preparations to assert her equality in manful fight. Her sails had been gradually reduced to the usual quantity, and, by certain movements on her deck, the lieutenant and his constant attendant, the pilot, well understood that she only wanted to lessen her distance a few 100 yards to begin the action. "Now spread everything," whispered the stranger. Griffith applied the trumpet to his mouth and shouted in a voice that was carried even to the enemy, "Let fall! Out with your booms! Sheet home! Hoist away of everything!" The inspiring cry was answered by a universal bustle. 50 men flew out on the dizzy heights of the different spars, while broad sheets of canvas rose as suddenly along the mast as if some mighty bird were spreading its wings. The Englishman instantly perceived his mistake, and he answered the artifice by a roar of artillery. Griffith watched the effects of the broadside with an absorbing interest, as the shot whistled above his head, but when he perceived his masts untouched, and the few unimportant ropes only that were cut, he replied to the uproar with a burst of pleasure. A few men were, however, seen clinging with wild frenzy to the cordage, dropping from rope to rope like wounded birds fluttering through a tree, until they fell heavily into the ocean, the sullen ship sweeping by them in cold indifference. At the next instant the spars and masts of their enemy exhibited a display of men similar to their own, when Griffith again placed the trumpet to his mouth and shouted aloud, Give it to them. Drive them from their yards. Boys, scatter them with your grape. Unreeve their rigging." The crew of the American wanted but little encouragement to enter on this experiment with hearty goodwill, and the close of his cheering words were uttered amid the deafening roar of his own cannon. The pilot had, however, mistaken the skill and readiness of their foe, for, notwithstanding the disadvantageous circumstances under which the Englishman increased his sail, the duty was steadily and dexterously performed. The two ships were now running rapidly on parallel lines, hurling at each other their instruments of destruction with furious industry, and with severe and certain loss to both, though with no manifest advantage in favor of either. Both Griffith and the pilot witnessed with deep concern this unexpected defeat of their hopes, for they could not conceal from themselves that each moment lessened their velocity through the water, as the shot of their enemy stripped the canvas from the yards or dashed aside the lighter spars in their terrible progress. "We find our equal here," said Griffith to the stranger. "The 90 is heaving up again like a mountain, and if we continue to shorten sail at this rate she will soon be down upon us." "You say true, sir," returned the pilot, musing. "The man shows judgment as well as spirit, but—" He was interrupted by Mary, who rushed from the forward part of the vessel, his whole face betokening the eagerness of his spirit and the importance of his intelligence. "The breakers!" he cried, when nigh enough to be heard amid the din. "We are running dead on a ripple, and the sea is white not 200 yards ahead." The pilot jumped on a gun, and bending to catch a glimpse through the smoke, he shouted, in those clear, piercing tones that could be even heard among the roaring of the cannon: "Port! Port your helm! We are on the devil's grip! Pass up the trumpet, sir! Port your helm, fellow! Give it to them, boys! Give it to the proud English dogs!" Griffith unhesitatingly relinquished the symbol of his rank, fastening his own firm look on the calm but quick eye of the pilot, and gathering assurance from the high confidence he read in the countenance of the stranger. The seamen were too busy with their cannon and their rigging to regard the new danger, and the frigate entered one of the dangerous passes of the shoals, in the heat of a severely contested battle. The wondering looks of a few of the older sailors glanced at the sheets of foam that flew by them, in doubt whether the wild gambols of the waves were occasioned by the shot of the enemy, when suddenly the noise of cannon was succeeded by the sullen wash of the disturbed element, and presently the vessel glided out of her smoky shroud, and was boldly steering in the centre of the narrow passages. For 10 breathless minutes longer the pilot continued to hold an uninterrupted sway, during which the vessel ran swiftly by ripples and breakers, by streaks of foam and darker passages of deep water, when he threw down his trumpet and exclaimed: "What threatened to be our destruction has proved our salvation. Keep yonder hill crowned with wood, one point open from the church tower at its base, and steer east by north. You will run through these shoals on that course in an hour, and by so doing you will gain 5 leagues of your enemy, who will have to double their tail, the Alliance and the English 32. The moment he stepped from the gun, the pilot lost the air of authority that had so singularly distinguished his animated form, and even the close interest he had manifested in the incidents of the day became lost in the cold, settled reserve he had affected during his intercourse with his present associates. Every officer in the ship, after the breathless suspense of uncertainty had passed, rushed to those places where a view might be taken of their enemies. The 90 was still steering boldly onward, and had already approached the 2 and 30, which lay a helpless wreck, rolling on the unruly seas that were rudely tossing her on their wanton billows. The frigate last engaged was running along the edge of the ripple, with her torn sails flying loosely in the air, her ragged spars tottering in the breeze, and everything above her hull exhibiting the confusion of a sudden and unlooked for check to her progress. The exulting taunts and mirthful congratulation of the seamen as they gazed at the English ships were, however, soon forgotten in the attention that was required to their own vessel. The drums beat the retreat, the guns were lashed, the wounded again removed, and every individual able to keep the deck was required to lend his assistance in repairing the damages of the frigate and securing her masts. The promised hour carried the ship safely through all the dangers, which were much lessened by daylight, and by the time the sun had begun to fall over the land, Griffith, who had not quitted the deck during the day, beheld his vessel once more cleared of the confusion of the chase and battle, and ready to meet another foe. At this period he was summoned to the cabin, at the request of the ship's chaplain, delivering the charge of the frigate to Barnstable, who had been his active assistant, no less in their subsequent labours than in the combat. He hastily divested himself of the vestiges of the fight, and proceeded to obey the repeated and earnest call. End of Story 4, Part 2. Biographical Notes. Cooper, J. F., born in New Jersey, 1789, died 1851. He followed the sea for 5 years, after 3 years at Yale. His first novel, Precaution, was published when he was 30. His chief books are The Spy, The Pilot, The Last of the Mohicans, The Prairie, Red Rover, The Bravo, The Pathfinder, The Deerslayer, The Two Admirals, Wing and Wing, and Satin Stow, all of them either sea tales or tales of frontier life.